Ahoy! Today we're doing a surprisingly highly requested video, and that's essentially an update of something I did a long time ago, which is guards by power curve. So in this video I will be listing guards by their strength, if they're more of an early game guard, mid game guard, late game guard, or an all-rounder. Now I have done this twice in the past, but it's been a while since and a lot of guards change over time, so I think it is worth talking about again, and with the amount of requests that I got for it, let's just do it. So we're going to begin with Achilles and then just go through them alphabetically. Or in this order here, I think they should be alphabetically. Looks like it. Achilles is definitely an all-rounder, has a relatively strong early stage or earlier-ish stages at least. And then because of the execute, he goes very well into late game. Agni, also an all-rounder, good early pressure, good early clear especially. And then especially after level 5, obviously it ramps up a lot. And then towards late game, the ultimate still does its work. Musen Cup is someone I would put probably around early to mid, because he works well once he has his abilities. He needs his abilities to fully get the pressure and then stays relevant, but in late game he just can't do as much because he has to navigate around his hives and everything. So he falls off a little bit there. Apuash. This one's a little bit harder. I would say that it's definitely not an early game guard, because you would have to be very dominant at that stage without having full access to your abilities, which basically doesn't work. You need at least level 2 to really make things happen with him. And at the same time, I wouldn't necessarily classify him as a super late game guard either, because then there's just a lot more potential to play around him. He doesn't have an escape. So I would say, generally speaking, he's probably around mid game, but I find it hard to place him because his general performance at the moment isn't exactly high pressure or anything on the larger scope of the battleground of the gods. Amaterasu is very interesting. She used to be super late game, but she got so many buffs to her early game that I would honestly say at this point she's probably an all-rounder. She had some things that tweaked her performance across all levels a bit, but I can't say that she's just late game anymore, because really she does do well in earlier stages, and her sustain is more valuable than before and everything. So yeah, I think it's an all-rounder. Anhur, I would say, is early to mid. He's not super early, because again, level 1 is not his strongest level, though his level 1 is also not terrible, but he definitely carries over well into mid game, and then late game there's other ADCs that do more. Anubis, I could put into early to mid. Yeah, I think I'm going to do that as well. He's definitely one of those guys that has very good pressure and very early, but he transitions pretty well into mid game. And late game, again, he's lacking the mobility, but he can actually offset that quite well by just healing up. He's just been performing very well as of late. Our Kong does not perform all too well until he has at least his ultimate, as well as a few items ideally, so I would say he's definitely a mid to late game guard. In very late game, he falls off a little bit because his team fight capabilities aren't the greatest. You could also put him like mid, somewhere around here. Aphrodite. Aphrodite, I would say on one hand she has pretty good early, in the sense that she can't be bullied out of lane, but then on the other hand her late game is where, especially with a late game hyper carry, she also really shines. So I would say she's an all-rounder. Apollo, definitely not a late game guard, because his team fight is just not great. He's just a split pusher in late game. Also not really an early game guard though. There's definitely more dominant guards in early game. I would say he's around mid game where he does the most. Ragnar, 100% early game. She's got that super high level 1 pressure. Level 2 even scarier. So yeah, not really much to say there. Ares also generally still an early game guard. There are different playsets now that allow him to be how to put that, to be more of a mid game guard at least, but that's more niche. Like from a support perspective, at least I would say he's early, or maybe early to mid, depending on how you want to look at it. But in late game, he definitely falls off. Artemis is quite the opposite. I would say Artemis is actually mid to late, I would say, because for late game, I think she would do a little bit better in like super late if she had an escape to work with. But generally speaking, mid to late is where she shines. RTO definitely falls off. I would put a because of her general performance at the moment, I would say she's more of an early to mid game god. She's got a lot of pressure in the early stages, and then in late game, she just doesn't have as much impact as other gods. And the same applies for Athena as well, where I would almost put it more towards mid game though. But yeah, no, really, the rotations in early to mid game, that's I think where Athena does the most. A Willish, she used to be a super early god once upon a time, but it's changed. But then she got buffed again, and she goes back and forth. But then I think she is better when she has like level 5 at least and has some items going for her. I would say at this point, she's closer to a mid game god than to an early game god, somewhere here. Realistically, I would honestly put her mid game at this point. She definitely still falls off, but I think she does more in mid game than she does in early in most situations, especially because you can't invade nearly as easily anymore. But Bayaga, on the other hand, is super late game. The longer the game goes, the more she can do. Even without an escape, her ultimate kind of offsets that. Well, she has an escape, short escape. Can't say without an escape. Baku's an interesting one because he's not an early game god, but then he's also not a pure late game god. I'm just gonna put Baku's as a bit of an all-rounder with a slight question mark. I would say his super early is definitely very weak, but then early to mid, I think it's not that weak anymore. But at the same time, no, maybe put him like mid to late. He's definitely a team fight god, so yeah, it should be fitting enough. Brakasura, also somebody who definitely falls off. I would say mid game is probably the most appropriate because he has early pressure, but usually like he's more focused on farming until he gets his items online, and then he can really do things until he has some mobility, some attack speed going, and that's usually around mid game. Baron Samdi, actually very interesting. I think Samdi's an all-rounder. He does have weaker spots. Late game, he's not as strong as an early game, but I think he's not like he's a very consistent god across most stages of the game. Stat is somebody I haven't played in so long. I don't even know. She's definitely not an early game god anymore because the clear and stuff are not up to par, and I wouldn't call her a late game god, so she's probably a mid game god overall. Balona, also kind of hard to judge because she's not doing too hot. She used to be more of a lane bully, and I would say she's still somewhere around here, early to mid. I don't think she's really a late game god in that sense. Brecken, also a lot about how you look at it. He's definitely a good early game god. Yeah, I'll put him here as well. I think late game is his weakest point overall. His early is super strong, obviously, and he does a lot of things in mid game still, but then late game, if you have the right items, he still does a lot. Camazot's very strong lane pressure, but also I think his team fight impact should not be underestimated. I'm going to put him as an all-rounder. He kind of works at any point. And I think that also applies for Cerberus. But at the same time, Cerberus is maybe a little bit more early to mid-game. The problem I have with placing Cerberus here is that his ultimate is also very strong in late game. Maybe we just put him on all-rounder because he kind of covers this entire area. You're going to see a lot of gods going into early mid or mid to late, by the way, because a lot of gods are not clearly defined by one strict point. Kononos is one of those mid-game gods. In early game, he's not, like, he doesn't start on level 1 really. In the late game, you have better choices most of the time, but in the middle of the game, that's where you want to have him. Chuck is definitely an early game god. That's an easy one. He just does the most, and the longer the game goes, the more he falls off, essentially. Though that's not as bad as it used to be for him. Chang'e, I would say, is a late game goddess. It doesn't mean that she's only good in late game, but she's also one of those where the more items she has, the better she becomes on a larger scale than other gods. Chernobog, interesting one. I think he is, in a way, to me, he's an all-rounder because he's got his mobility, he's got a steroid, he's got everything of that sort. And his ultimate is not really a late game ultimate for an ADC, but at the same time, it can work well in team fight. I could see people not agreeing with this choice, and I would be like completely fine with someone saying he's more of a mid-game god or whatever. I can see that. I can see that as well. It's somewhere between those. Maybe we just put him as a mid-game god. I find it's relatively hard to place hunters in general because they're designed to work into late game. So usually that's a bit complicated. Chiron is definitely more of an early to mid-game god, leaning more towards early, but he's like a super early god. We will have some other hunters that are more early game. Kronos, late game. The longer the game goes, the better he gets. No question there. Cthulhu is an all-rounder, pretty strong lane presence, and then late game, he's a beast. But then in very late game, there's also more counters to him. And Cuchulainn, Cuchulainn, I would say, is probably more of an early game god in some ways, but at the same time, once he rolls out of solo, he's also very, very potent. I'm gonna put him all-rounder. Cupid used to be all kinds of things, but now he's definitely an all-rounder. He's got that early pressure, but he's also got massive impact in late game with the new builds and everything in the current meta, so it doesn't really change. Daji, not an early game goddess, and also not a late game goddess because she gets singled out a lot better in late game, so I would definitely put her into mid game here. Discordia, probably also around mid game. At the same time, her teamfight potential is very strong on the right circumstances. So maybe a mid to late game goddess here. Either that or an all-rounder, but I don't really see her being that impactful in early. So we're going to put her here. Also more of a debatable choice. Erlang Shen, high pressure early into high pressure mid into decent impact late game. Somewhere between all-rounder and mid to and early to mid. I am gonna put him early to mid because his late game is not quite as strong. Fafnir, on the other hand, I would say is more of a later stages god. Does have some weak points in very late game, so maybe like mid to late game god. Fenrir, I was thinking of putting him early to mid. Now I'm thinking if it's actually more towards mid game because he does work better with a few items, but I still think his early to mid game is still pretty good overall, so we're gonna put it here. Freya, generally speaking, more of a mid to late game god in my opinion. Early game is not the strongest. She works pretty well in mid game though. In very late game she can get focused out more, but she also does a ton of damage. Ganesh, strong lane pressure, but keeps his presence into late game, so I would say he's an all-rounder. Geb, more of a late game god, but really also an all-rounder because his impact can be felt at any point of the game, especially through the shield. That's just always viable. Guanyu, more active, I would say, in mid stages maybe, or mid to... He's got very high early pressure in some scenarios, especially if you're not playing him solo. So there's room in either direction here. I'm going to put him mid because that's where you will consistently see him do well, but you can also really put him into all-rounder because the heal is always going to be valuable at any stage. I just feel that the ult, for example, is something that falls off a little bit. Hachiman, not an early game god. Also, probably not a late game god, to be honest. Maybe a little bit more late game than some other ADCs, but I would still put him around mid game, where he gets like a lot of ability damage pressure as well as a lot of basic attack pressure. Hades is probably an early game god, primarily, but what's nice about him is that he doesn't fall off as much. So he can get things going from level 1, but he carries that over very well until mid to late game, so he's not by any means weak after that. Habois, probably an all-rounder. Even in late game, well, his early game can be weak, but that's not as much of a problem anymore. And even in late game, if he gets singled out, he can just burst back usually, so usually it doesn't become a huge problem for him. Heimdall, lots of pressure there, lots of damage there in early stages. If he singles the target on late game, that can still be a lot of damage, but he doesn't hold up as well as some other late game ADCs. So I would say more of a mid-game character primarily. You notice that I'm kind of hesitant with the hunters because they all kind of have this awkward, unique spot, basically. Hell, somewhere between late game and all-rounder. I would say, though, that the strongest point of Hell is in late game. So we are going to put a late game. Obviously, there's more anti-heal at that point as well, but I think a late game Hell is pretty unstoppable. Hera. Pretty strong early pressure, but that holds up well into late game as well now. So I'm going to put her an all-rounder. Could also put her like around mid-game, but I think overall she's an all-rounder. Hercules, on the other hand, is a very high-pressure early game god. You could also put him in early to mid, maybe. But I do think that his strongest point is early and is just a slight decline afterwards. His strongest point is basically level 2, level 3-ish. Horus. I think Horus is also an all-rounder because he has pretty strong early game pressure, but then he also has significant impact in late game, especially with his ultimate. So yeah, neither should be underestimated here. Hu Yi is probably one of the ADCs that has a little bit more to do in earlier stages. He is not as much early game as Anhur maybe, but he is less mid game than some of these others, I would say. But at the same time, also not. It's a tough one. His late game ultimate is actually still pretty potent as well, and the mark, if you get on the right target, maybe it's just more of an all-rounder. It's very, I find it very hard to place. Once again, he doesn't have a steroid, and his escape is not the best. So those are like weak points in late game, but the big old kind of offsets that. The mark kind of offsets that. Stealth counter as well. So there's some things there. Hunbatz, I would say definitely a mid to late game god. So as soon as you have the ultimate and you have some items going, some cooldown reduction, that's when he really is his strongest. Iset, or however we want to call her now, more of an early game goddess. Does well into mid game. Late game, she still has impact, of course, with the ultimate and everything, but earlier stages is where she gets more going. Her level 1 pressure is also insane. You could also put her, you could even put her up to early, and I wouldn't disagree. Izanami, somehow I gotta say, so rarely see that I find it very hard to judge. She does have a fair bit of ability damage, so that can't be understated. And she does have that early pressure, early clear. At the same time, she does not have the best level 1. So maybe put her here as well. She still works well into late game at the same time. That's what complicates it for me. Because she has that steroid, she has that stealth still. I think she's also going to be all-rounder. I think ADCs are just going to be either mid-stage or all-rounder, unless they're like significantly different, like Anhur here or Chiron. Janus. Not a late game god most of the time. He has that one-shot potential, but outside of that, not super late game. Early game, I would say, is also not the strongest. I would say around mid game is his best point. Jing Wei, all-rounder. And that's just because she isn't exactly a high-pressure goddess in early, but she just can't lose lane. She'll always come back, and then eventually she's got her item going, and then she's fine. So, yeah, I could also put it like mid to late, but that would kind of not do her passive justice. I think we have to factor that in. Yermungandr. I think in very late game, his impact is a little bit dampened. In earlier stages, it's better. His level 1 is not the strongest on its own. Kind of hard. Maybe mid or mid to, maybe mid. Early to mid, somewhere around here. Yeah, I'm just gonna put him mid because like he's not an early god, he's not a late god, so this area somehow is where he would fit. Only late game Didas because of her snowball potential. She needs her items and everything. The later the game, the better for her, even though she's not necessarily weak at earlier stages than that. Capri. I would say Capri is an all-rounder. Pretty good early pressure with a 2, and the threat of the 1 is always there. And then Well, and the 3 as well. Can't underestimate that. And then in late game, his ultimate just does so much. It's unusual in how he's played in late game compared to other supports, but it does so much. King Arthur. Tough one. Probably also an all-rounder at this point, really, because he does have bully potential in lane still to some degree. And in later stages now with the item changes, with different Glad Shield, and with like just generally like having Stone of Gaia and having high protections going does a lot for him. So I would say an all-rounder overall. Kukulkan, definitely more of an early game god. I would almost make the argument, his level 1 is so obnoxious with the tornado that he's just an early game god, but I think maybe early to mid, because his mid game is still pretty good. Similar to Anubis, actually, really, when you think about it. Kumbhakana. High-ish pressure early. Probably, like, definitely not the best late game god out there. Yeah, I would say around here. I would say early to mid is where he does a lot. And then once it comes to team fighting and you have to hit more targets with more than a mess, then it's where he falls off. Kuzenbo. High pressure early, again. How much does he fall off late game, though? I would almost put him more towards mid game, because I think his ultimate is pretty good. Even though his early isn't bad by any stretch of imagination. In very late, I find his disruption to be a little bit less than some other gods, but yeah, also one of those where I'm not 100% set on him being there, but I think that's a decent place at least. Loki, with all his changes, let me think what he could be now. I think Loki is not an early game god and is not a late game god, and that puts him in the middle, because like I think in mid game he has a little bit of everything. He has sufficient burst to take down squishies. His team fight utility can be used. He can clear camps pretty quickly at that point. So I think that's a pretty good combination overall. Medusa, definitely more towards early mid-ish, similar to Anhur really in any way. Mercury, technically a late game god. I will put him more like mid to late, because he comes online a fair bit earlier than Kali and can have pretty decent impact at that point already. Merlin. Merlin has pretty good pressure in early stages, and it translates over pretty well into later stages. I'm just thinking if I would say that it's still equally impactful in late game. I would say between the ranged CC, instant mobility, and everything else, I can give that to him. So I'm just going to say, generally speaking, he's an all-rounder. Also one of those cards where I don't have the most experience. Mulan technically gets better throughout the match, but at the same time, her kit also has a little less impact throughout the match, and she can be countered better. I would say somewhere around here. I'm just gonna give a... No, do you want to do that? Mid to late. I feel like even though she's been released a while ago, she still hasn't fully found her identity in what where she wants to be, how she wants to be, and everything. Naja. Not a late game god, I would say more of an early to mid god, but also does pretty well into mid game. So you could also put him into mid. He has the damage that he has to fight, and he also works well with like mid game builds essentially. So maybe put him mid game. But then nah, ring toss is so good. I've gotta go early to mid. Neath probably also early to mid, not super crazy on level 1. She had changes that make her better in later stages, but overall I think her design lends itself towards those earlier stages more than towards later stages. Nemesis could be put in mid or mid to late. I'm just gonna put her mid to late because I think she does decently in early game as well. It's not like she's weak there, but she is designed to have more impact at later stages when you have a full build. Nike. Nike is weird now. I mean, especially with the 2, you could make the argument that she's an excellent late game counter in a way to some things. But then in late game, she also gets countered a lot more herself by sprint or by other means of countering. It could be Sunder at this point. And that kind of offsets that in a way. I don't know if I want to make that an argument to not. I'm just going to put her all rounder because I'm really not sure where else I would put her. I think, alternatively, I could put her around mid, but then the passive makes her great for late game as well. So I think that makes him more of an all-rounder. Nox, I haven't really had enough experience since her new change, so I can't really say what she does in that regard. I would say she always had decent bully potential in earlier stages through her combo. If she lands that's just insane damage. In later stages, it still works, but it doesn't work as well. Can be countered more, can be countered easier. Maybe we say early to mid. Maybe that's. But then her ultimate, She shines in team fights in many ways with her ultimate and with her 3 as well. So maybe also mid. I don't know. Early to mid. Let's put early to mid. Noir, definitely not an early game goddess. Like, the later the game goes, the better, generally speaking. At the same time, I wouldn't say she's like quite Hell or Chunga or Kronos level in that regard. I think she does pretty decent around mid game. Maybe she's like mid to late. But then on earlier stages, if you combo someone right, it also does a lot. What you notice with a lot of these cards is they're not as strict in their placements as they used to be. Maybe I'll talk about that at the end. Odin, overall, still more of an early game focused card, and in the late game you have to work around what you have, and that works a lot better than it used to, but I would say his stronger point is still in early game. Oleron, really, he is good in earlier stages, but in late game his ultimate just turns team fights more than anything else, and I still think that it's too strong. So I would say his latest stage is probably his strongest, regardless of other stages also being good. Then we have Osiris, who's definitely more of an early game god. I would go as far as putting him here, but he gets a little bit better once he's got a few points in his abilities, actually. So strongest point is early to mid, but he's a lot more early than some other gods here. Pili, pretty solid mid-game god. You could also say like mid-game to late game maybe, but I think around mid-game, when she's got a little bit going for her in terms of abilities and items, that's when she works very well. And then in very late game team fights, her kit is just a lot more risky than it is earlier, so that makes her fall off a little bit. At the same time, she also gets a lot of benefits, like for example, the 2 ring expanding while leveling it up. So that helps a lot. And then we have Persephone. I would say Persephone is probably an all-rounder. She does a lot of things in early game already, and then she works all the way into late game, so not really much else that needs to be said there. Poseidon. More mid-game than Anubis or Kukulkan. Wouldn't necessarily call him super late game because he's best at points where he can still easily burst people. In late game, he rolls more on his mobility. Both works, but I would say mid game is his strongest point. Raijin. Haven't seen him in a while. His early game is alright. It's good enough in terms of clearing and pressure. I feel like in late game he struggles because of his lock him in place sometimes. But he can also do stupid amounts of damage there. Maybe we'll put him here with Poseidon in the middle. I think that is where his strongest point is. Ra. Ra has pretty good pressure early, but I think his kit translates very well into late game because he's a healer. So I'm going to put Ra as an all-rounder, even though he is easier to focus in late game. But still, he's got a ton of movement speed at that point as well. Ram. Ram is surprisingly good in earlier stages, in my opinion, at this point. It used to be like a purely, strictly late game, but now I think he's got a lot more potential in earlier stages. Generally speaking, I think he's still got more going from in mid-late, where he can go in there, use the steroid, and do a ton of damage, and then pick out someone in a team fight with the ultimate. I think that ultimate just is very game-changing because it takes him out of the fight for a long time. Tusker, more of an early to mid-ish god. Got a lot of pressure on level 3 especially. But then, yeah, in late game he definitely falls off. You could also put him into mid. I'd say early to mid. I think that's where he really does most of his things. Raven, probably go right with him there. Still can single all targets in late game and all, but really in early game, you don't want to run into a Raven because he does so much damage so easily. That's huge for him. Scylla, with the reset of her ultimate and everything, I would say she's definitely more towards late. Is she super late? No, I think she comes online a bit earlier than that. I think she comes online in mid-game and does decent things there. Serket, not the best early game. Her late game can be good, but it's often situational. I'm going to put her mid-game. Set. Maybe an all-rounder at this point. It's obviously, like, level 1 is not his best point, but it's also not awful since they buffed the 1. And then into later stages, he works very well and he snowballs very well. I probably would put him as an all-rounder, especially because in different roles, his power curve is also slightly different. So I think that's fair. Skadi, more of an early to mid-game god overall. Not the strongest on level 1, but level 3-ish, 2-3-ish, she comes online basically, and she does a lot for a while, and then in late game, she just gets caught out a lot easier. Sobek, in a way he's an all-rounder, I would say, but it's very hard to place him there. So Sobek has that survivability in early game, and then in late game he just does Sobek things, and the pluck is always dangerous. Yeah, maybe that's a good justification to put him into all-rounder. It's just the existence of the pluck. Sol, magical ADCs. Not quite Kronos. I would say she's more of a mid-game goddess. She doesn't do quite as much in late game. In early, there are other mages that definitely outpressure her. So, well, not definitely. Like, they do outpressure her, though. But, yeah, around mid-game, I would say, is where she does the most. Samwu Kong, well, either early or early to mid. I would almost say early to mid, actually. Early to mid, since everything about solo and stuff has changed. I would say early to mid. Its impact carries over for quite a while as well. Susano, relatively hard for me to say. Probably also mid-game, like most assassins. Doesn't really have the best very early clear, and then in very late game, his like combo just doesn't have quite as much impact. So yeah, I would say around mid-game. Sylvanas, probably more of an early to mid-game god, especially because of the heal. There is the factor that he still has the heal in late game, obviously, and that his ult is pretty good in late game, so I'm kind of trying to consider what I want to do based on that. He doesn't bring the same pressure as an early, though, and he's... If he falls behind or is focused out too much, that is really, really heavy on the Sylvanas. But then the pole is also very good. Well, on the same justification that I put Sobek into all-rounder, I think Sylvanas also, in a way, belongs into all-rounder. Terra. Terra I find incredibly hard to place because she's just difficult. I think she's got pretty decent early, pretty good early, and then her ultimate is massive in later stages. I think the ultimate outweighs her early, honestly. So maybe I put her in mid to late, but this is also one of those where I'm not 100% set on this. Like, place her where you will. Thanatos, on the other hand, I'm very set on. Is an early game god. his level 1 is insane. He is still better at later stages now than he used to be, so he transitions very well across the game, but yeah. Morrigan. The very early is not the best, but then after that she kind of just does her thing, and she can always turn into somebody else and have impact that way. So I would say, generally speaking, she is an all-rounder just because of the unpredictability of her ult. Thor, probably an early to mid god. As early as, like, once you get a few levels, he's very, very strong, and then gradually falls off throughout the game more than some other assassins. If you compare them side by side here, you may find that you want to play Thor more towards mid game maybe, but I do think that he brings more to early than some of these other assassins here. Bastet, for example, like Thor's early is definitely better than Bastet. Thoth. Rarely ever see a Thoth these days. I would say more mid to late. Yeah, I think that's fitting because his potential in late game and the damage that he can do from a distance is very high. And in earlier stages, he has a while to ramp up first before he reaches that. So Kiyomi is an all-rounder. He's just strong at any point, really, from early game to late game. He is counterable, but there's a lot of ways in which he can work against you. Tyr is no stage of the game at the moment, I guess. I would put him into early to mid, or maybe even just early. I mean, I guess in a way he's strongest in early at the moment, sadly, and then after that, yeah, I can't say. I feel like he's almost an early. No, maybe early to mid. Tough choice. Maybe move Hercules down with him. I don't know. Oops, I just moved Samwu Kong. It's really with these like self-healing bully gods. I find it very hard to say, but I think Hercules has more early pressure than Tyr at this point. This is the hunter I was looking for. Finally, a hunter that I can put in early game or super high early pressure, basically from level 1, and then gradually falls off a little bit throughout the game. Vaman. Big Baby does not hold up as well in very late. I would say he is a mid-game character. Gets a few levels going and then does a lot of things for a while and then gradually falls off a little bit. Vulcan. I find it hard to make a case for how much of an early game Vulcan has or not. It's just different with the turret. I think people would have very different opinions on that. I do think that in late game he has a lot of potential. At the same time, he lacks the good escape. I would say he's a bit of an all-rounder, honestly. I think his ultimate alone gives him some viability at earlier stages. He's also not a super late game god outside of that, so I would say that's a pretty good fit. Shivalanke, I would say he's a mid to late game character. Maybe even a pure late game. No. I think his ultimate has too much impact in earlier stages already to just put him into mid to late. Xingtian, good early presence, translating into a pretty strong late game. I'd say it's an all-rounder. Yemoja. I think a well-played Yemoja is strong at any point. Her level 1 is very, very strong, but her ultimate is also very strong in late game. So, yeah. I think she's strong at any point. Ymir, more of an early to mid-game god, I would say. That's really where he makes a big damage plays, and then in late game he doesn't have all that much to offer. You have to play around the wall a lot. Zeus needs a few items, needs a few of everything to get going. Then he does things for a while, and then he falls off, so I would say he's mid-game. Shang-Kui, on the other hand, wants to survive a little bit longer, have the game going a little bit longer, and then he ends up doing better. And that is all. That is the current overview of power curves in SMITE, early to late game gods. As you can see, obviously pure early gods and pure late game gods, relatively small pools. and then a lot here in the early to mid and mid area. Not quite as many in mid to late, but you know, it carries over a lot as well. A lot of mid game guards are still okay, or are still decent in mid to late. They're just not as emphasized on that point of the game. And obviously a lot of all-rounder guards here as well. Though keep in mind with this, obviously this is not something that's set in stone. Many guards can be played differently with different builds, and that changes their performance in one way or another. So don't be upset if one guard that you play differently or that you see differently is maybe placed in a place where you wouldn't place them. It's not my intention to go against anyone's playstyle or anything. It's just to give people a general idea of how the guard that they're playing will roughly feel, and at what point of the game they will probably feel strongest in the general overall outlook on most situations or something. I don't know how to put that better. But yeah, I hope this was a good overview. I hope this gave you a basic understanding of this. If you're new to the channel, feel your sub button and maybe the bell so you get notified of other upcoming SMITE videos. And other than that, I hope to see you for the next one soon. ZiSotto, out.